a lot of people were up all night following this 36-hour whirlwind between Russia's Ministry of Defense, and the Wagner PMC, the not paramilitary, but the private military contractor that's been doing all of the heroic fighting in Ukraine uh, on the Russian side. It's been doing all of the fighting. It's had really massive success. Bakhmut not being the least of it. And also Wagner is everywhere. Wagner's on the African continent. It's in Syria. It did a lot of the heavy lifting during Russia's intervention in Syria at the invitation of the Syrian government beginning in 2015. But over the last 36 hours, so June 23rd, June 24th, what we saw was a series of developments. You had Prigozhin claim that his forces were being basically struck at. There was a unverified video going around of possibly Russia bombing Wagner sites, units. And then you had Prigozhin declare mutiny, essentially, a rebellion, that he was going to march with his forces, however many there were. And I think it's still a question of how many he had. I think it was actually quite a small number, but he ended up in Rostov on Don in the city. There was supposedly a takeover. A lot of questions about that coverage. A lot of people are now saying that it wasn't a takeover per se, but that there was, Wagner forces in the city. They were engaging with the defense buildings and units there, but there wasn't really a coup. There wasn't really a takeover. Everything in the city was working as promised, but Russia responded. I mean, they did declare martial law. They did issue orders to people for their own safety. And according to Prigozhin, he claims that he was 200 kilometers from Moscow, unclear whether he was or not, and that they just averted bloodshed. So what ended up happening actually not too long ago, on June 24th, was Prigozhin and supposedly Belarus's president, Mr. Lukashenko, negotiated with Russia's approval a deal that would end Wagner's mutiny. There's all sorts of speculation about perhaps Wagner did strike on, on Russia's air force, that it did shoot down a couple of helicopters, planes. But nonetheless, the unrest is at least formally over. Now, Vladimir Putin issued a strong statement, and the FSB in the Russian government labeled Prigozhin a traitor, and the result of that was exile. Essentially, Prigozhin has been sent to Belarus. That's where he will be. He will no longer be head of Wagner. Russia has given the green light for those forces that didn't take part in the mutiny to come under the control of the Ministry of Defense. And so I just want to show you what Vladimir Putin had to say as this was happening. Here is a short video of
renegade
that.
actions.
Here's what he had to say in reaction
The action
to this
that
development.
split our unity. So the action that split our unity are basically an act of renegade actions against those fighting in the front. It's a stab in the back against our country and our nation. And this stab was dealt to Russia in 1917 while the country was fighting in World War I. But its victory was stolen from it. Intrigues, bickering behind the nation's back turned into a great catastrophe. So the destruction of army and the collapse of a state, the loss of huge vast territories, and the tragedy of the civil war, when Russians went against Russians and brother went against a brother. And profiting from that were various adventures and foreign forces that were tearing the country apart. We will not let that repeat. We will not let that happen again. We will defend our country and our statehood from any threats, including internal treason. And what we're facing now is treason. Big ambitions and personal interests have led to betrayal one's country, one's nations, and the cause for which Wagner's group fighters and commanders were fighting along with the armed forces.
So that's what Putin had to say. And, you know, he called it treasonous. I don't necessarily agree with him wholesale on the comparison, given that what he's referencing with regard to 1917 and World War I, you know, at the end of the day, it was the Tsarist forces that were causing the divisions by their actions in World War I and how they were treated, how the Tsarist regime, this dynasty, was treating, you know, peasants, poor people, working people. And so the response to that was quite ideological, right? Like the Bolsheviks were not fighting for personal ambitions. The Bolsheviks were fighting really for survival and to improve their lot, given that the combination of the war and the economic situation in Russia at that time was just totally untenable. This is completely different in the sense that Prigozhin now, Prigozhin does have, as Putin said, personal ambitions, and it's obvious that his conflict was not with Putin or the Russian government, so it wasn't a coup, so to speak, but it was him looking to grab power, and he's been doing this for a while. We're going to get into that, but I want to talk to you, show what Scott Ritter had to say about this. He was on Judge Napolitano, I think that's how you say his name. He's a frequent guest there. He's also a great friend of this show, Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector. He had a theory that I am more interested in. Of course, there's a lot of speculation, and we don't necessarily have evidentiary basis for this, but he has a theory that does have some backing to it, that Prigozhin is essentially a recruit of the Ukrainian intelligence services and, of course, the Western intelligence services that they're owned by. And I found that to be very compelling, given Prigozhin's behavior before this, right during the time where Bakhmut was falling to Russia earlier this year. But I just want to play you what he had to say in reaction to this, because I think it's important. We'll play about 5 minutes of this. So here we go. He's just going to react to the question, what's your take on this?
Well, first of all, this is a very serious turn of events. Evgeny Prigozhin, who is the public face of the Wagner private military contract group, who has achieved some prominence as a capable combat unit, given their performance in Bakhmut, the bloody battle, the so-called meat grinder that killed 75,000 Ukrainian soldiers at a cost of 30,000 Wagner lives. It appears that he has turned his forces on Russia, on the Russian government, on Vladimir Putin himself, ostensibly done to target Shoigu, the defense minister, and Gerasimov, the head of the Russian general staff, two people that Prigozhin has had a very vocal and public feud with for many months now. He claimed initially that he wasn't targeting the president, that he was simply doing his patriotic duty to seek the removal of these two corrupt and ineffective people. But Vladimir Putin gave a speech earlier today where he made it clear that what he felt about what Prigozhin and Wagner were doing, he called them traitors. And after that speech, Prigozhin turned his sights on Putin. So let's be clear. This is an armed insurrection, a coup d'etat being orchestrated by Evgeny Prigozhin, using the combat forces of a private military contractor to forcibly remove the constitutionally mandated and instituted government of Russia. I will say this, that events have gone far beyond what Sky News is reporting. Wagner troops have pushed through the city of Voronezh and are heading towards Moscow. They're being actively engaged by Russian air helicopters. Are destroying Wagner vehicles on the highway. This isn't a machine gun nest that's being established out of Moscow. Thousands, tens of thousands of troops are being assembled, including heavy armor, artillery. And Putin has basically said, take the gloves off, put this thing down.
So luckily it didn't get to that point. So that was good. It did not get to that point. And according to Karl Za and others in Moscow, their sources, there wasn't really the feeling on the streets that there was going to be some imminent attack by Wagner on Moscow, no matter what Prigozhin says. So here, I think, there was a lot of concern when Wagner was literally marching, but it fizzled out quite quickly, actually. But let's continue, because the theory that he's about to pose, I think, is an interesting one, given that there's a lot of different angles we could look at it by, not least the angle of, we're not saying Prigozhin is an agent of the West per se, but not everybody knows that their operatives are agents of the West. Sometimes your personal ambitions can align so much that what you're doing is benefiting the enemy, and even if you're not aware of that, the enemy certainly is. And so here's what Scott Ritter has to say about that.
And put it down now. The Chechen forces, the Akhmat Special Forces, are being sent to Rostov right now. This is not a situation that's going to last very long. It will be violently suppressed, or at least attempted to be. Wagner made certain assumptions. Prigozhin made certain assumptions. So what a lot of people didn't know is that 2 days ago, prior to this, the Ukrainian intelligence service, they had a series of covert cells that were being positioned in Moscow, were uncovered by the FSB, Russian security, and rounded up. It appears that these cells were supposed to be in place in Moscow, so that as Prigozhin began to move towards Moscow, they would carry out a series of attacks, explosions, terrorist events that would terrorize the Russian people, reinforce the notion that Putin was an ineffective leader, and therefore the people of Moscow would welcome Wagner with open arms. This is a concerted effort between Wagner, the Ukrainian intelligence service, and their Western sponsors, in particular the British, to achieve what they've always been looking for, which is what they call a Moscow Maidan moment. We've discussed this. The only way that Ukraine could possibly win this war is if Russia implodes. And having been defeated on the battlefield, we see that, kudos to them. They recruited Prigozhin. There's no doubt in my mind that Evgeny Prigozhin is working on behalf of foreign intelligence services, carrying out their tasks. And that task is to collapse the government of Vladimir Putin. I personally believe that he won't succeed, but that's what's happening this morning.
So that's what happened, and Scott Ritter was right. He didn't succeed. Indeed, the so-called coup, all that, it went away pretty quickly when things started to get real. But at the same time, this theory that Prigozhin had been recruited by Ukrainian intelligence services is a compelling one, not because he is just some agent now, but because when you think about who benefits from all of this, on the one hand, I've heard things like this is a psyop. This was something that was planned. Russia wanted to do this so they could move units, so they could have NATO's eyes on this manufactured chaos. While some of that could be compelling, I've heard from sources I respect who have sources that indeed Russia was doing a lot of maneuvering, moving weaponry, moving artillery, doing those kind of things, preparing for the next phase of the conflict with Ukraine. And while developments are so strange here that you could maybe believe it was a psyop, at the same time, Evgeny Prigozhin has for a while been acting very erratically. And some have speculated, people I respect, the Duran, others who really dive deep into these things, have speculated, well, he's not well mentally. And sure, Prigozhin, not a soul, whether you're a soldier or not, the level of bloodshed in Bakhmut alone that has been witnessed by Prigozhin and the Wagner PMC forces is trauma beyond what most people could imagine. So indeed, that has an impact. Yes, it's been a meat grinder literally on the front lines. That's also damaging. But at the same time, the ambitions of Prigozhin have been quite clear when he has reacted in ways, especially around the time, especially in times where things are going well. So you have this moment, right, where Prigozhin behaves in this way, tries to stage this insurrection while things are going quite well on the battlefield for Russia. And remember, it was just a few months ago when Bakhmut was falling to Russia that Prigozhin was also, here's Radio Free Europe. Let me just show you this. They're covering the CIA outlet. They are talking about how Prigozhin now says ammunition supplies from Russia's defense ministry for his Wagner group have resumed because what was he saying? He was saying on February 21st, they had no ammunition on 2023, no ammunition to fight back against Ukraine. And he showed supposedly pictures of dead mercenaries. And he lambasted Russia's defense ministry, right? That it was a spit in the eye of the Wagner private military group in an attempt to cover up its crimes against the fighters who today are carrying out acts of bravery. That was his response to the statement of the defense ministry denying that there was any kind of shortage. So he's already shown basically insubordination, right? While Wagner isn't under the Ministry of Defense, or wasn't formally at that time, nonetheless, he had already shown this erraticism, this claim, making claims. He didn't prove any of these claims. This unverified photos, right, showing that Russia is being negligent. And then he does this, right? He does this. He leads this insurrection and uses the language of essentially NATO, Ukraine, uses the language of this conflict is actually not what it seems to be. It's not demilitarization. It's not de-Nazification. It's none of that. It's not to get rid of the Nazis. It's not to demilitarize Ukraine and prevent NATO membership, etc. That it is just a fool's errand. It's for Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, to deceive all of Russia and drag Russia into a war. So that's the narrative of NATO, essentially. And that's what Prigozhin was putting out there. And so he was charged with treason. Now, the charges were dropped after this agreement with Lukashenko, the Russian government. He is going to go live in Belarus. A real big slap on the wrist, to be honest, given that there are claims that Wagner PMC forces did shoot at least a few aircraft, Russian aircraft, could have killed. Who knows if there are casualties? We don't know. We don't know whether it's injuries or deaths. But what we do know is that this behavior, while it does signal personal ambition, and indeed he could just be Prigozhin, just be a ambitious fellow with perhaps many screws loose. I think that oversimplifies the matter of what has happened here. In my opinion, and I've thought this from the beginning, and I've always took Scott Ritter's word for it, especially because he knows a lot more about military than I do, especially warfare, the details, the knit in the grit, what goes on the ground. And I trust his analysis a lot. I've always, however, been very suspicious of this idea of completely outsourcing this kind of war. Because on the one hand, in Syria, for example, I understand that you don't want Russian forces to experience casualties and damage unnecessarily. And so if you have this fighting force that's willing to go all in and also do it well, because I'm not here to condemn or criticize Wagner's performance or even question their, national pride and their commitment to Russia. No, but you have a mercenary group, a private military contractor that doesn't have leadership or discipline under Russia's Ministry of Defense, under Russia's military armed forces. Someone like Prigozhin seems to be a product of this like laissez-faire approach. And this approach has in the main worked. So this isn't even a criticism of it hasn't worked at all. But this outcome and development, how this happened, I believe it's likely too because someone like Prigozhin really couldn't exist in the sphere of Russia's armed forces and its Ministry of Defense, that you wouldn't see this happen or even be approached in the same way. But there was this quandary, and I think how Russia handled it is on the one hand positive, and on the other hand negative. I understand the Russian side not wanting this to be dramatic, not wanting it to be prolonged, not wanting there to be extensive coverage on this, attention on this, and also not wanting to anger perhaps some of those Wagner forces that do have sympathy for Prigozhin because of the common struggle that they all fought together, that he didn't want to execute him or just get rid of Prigozhin, right? Take his life. And a lot of people were calling for that on Telegram channels. And I was getting messages being like, he needs to be punished severely. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that, but I understand the Russian side not doing that, but taking pretty concerted action, exiling him. He's gone, right, to Belarus. Some people say he could come up and be a dangerous threat again. I'm not so sure if he's completely detached from Wagner and completely detached from any kind of military life. And also bringing Wagner's forces that are still wanting to fight on the side of Russia's objective when it comes to Ukraine, allowing them to do so under the Ministry of Defense from here on forward. And I think that is definitely the correct move. I mean, one of the big reasons why this happened was because you heard Prigozhin. He said in a statement today, before the negotiations were successful, he said they wanted to get rid of Wagner, and that's why he was doing this. And so there you see the personal ambition, right? The personal ambition that Prigozhin has. He not only wanted legitimacy and wanted respect, and I don't think those are necessarily bad things, but I do believe that is in conflict with Russia's Ministry of Defense, with Sergei Shoigu at the head of it, in large part because he probably wants to be in that position, in some kind of more powerful position, given all the success that he's had. I mean, he has a restaurant background, a business background. Now he's the head of a private military contractor. Ambition's kind of part of the job of a mercenary. And so this can cause problems, and it obviously caused problems, but it was way overblown. The coup talk, all of that, it never got to that point. But at the same time, this was a serious thing that happened. And I want to go over now, first, the reaction. So the reaction from the collective West, I mean, they were so happy that this happened. So happy. Coup, it's a coup. Oh, suddenly Wagner was no longer this persona non grata that has to be punished, and that's just this ragtag band of prisoners that are criminals and they're stupid and they can't do anything right. No longer were they the ire of Western insult. Now, the United States, as this was happening, They were monitoring the situation, they said, but they were also, according to the Wall Street Journal, they were also delaying sanctions. So they had to renew sanctions against Wagner, but they didn't want to when it seemed like Wagner was doing their bidding. So Washington reportedly did not want to be seen siding with Putin. So they delayed sanctions until after the insurrection ended. So the U.S. has postponed a fresh round of economic sanctions targeting the Wagner private military company after its leader, Evgeny Prigozhin, led an armed convoy towards Moscow in defiance of the Kremlin, said the Wall Street Journal on Saturday. According to the newspaper, the State Department was expected to announce sanctions on Wagner-linked gold businesses in Africa on Tuesday, including a mining operation in the Central African Republic. The plan was shelved, however, after Prigozhin accused the Russian military of shelling a Wagner training camp on Friday, led a convoy of troops toward Moscow the next day, vowing to confront senior Russian military leaders. The rebellion was diffused on Saturday evening, following talks between Prigozhin and Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. Washington does not want to appear to be taking sides in this, said an anonymous source to Wall Street Journal. With Putin accusing Prigozhin of treason and vowing decisive actions against the mutineers, the U.S. apparently felt sanctioning Wagner would aid the Russian leader. And so Wagner has been under sanctions since 2017 and was designated entity of particular concern by the State Department early December for allegedly threatening religious freedom in Africa. Hilarious. The organization was labeled a restricted military end user by the U.S. later that month and designated a significant transnational criminal organization this past January. So Wagner has been under sanctions for quite some time. But when Wagner looked like, or at least Prigozhin, because we don't know how many Wagner forces, some say it was a battalion. It was a small number in comparison to the 25,000 that they have. But nonetheless, when those forces seem to be doing the bidding of the United States and NATO, the United States was like, wait a minute, let's see if Wagner's really on our side. So I think, this theory that Scott Ritter has that, Wagner's head, Prigozhin, was recruited by Ukrainian intelligence. It's a tough call. I mean, I am definitely open to entertaining that has been attempted and that might have swayed his actions. But at the same time, when it comes to what transpired, it's obvious that whatever involvement, that since Prigozhin was showing instability, that, I mean, if you know anything about politics, anything about the U.S.'s record, NATO's record, Western intelligence services record, that they were going to try to find ways to get to Prigozhin even further. This is what they do. They're agents of chaos. And I said on Twitter, the United States and NATO countries, they're much better at sowing chaos than they are at actually waging war. I mean, that's just a fact, right? They can't. I'm not saying they get better at waging war in terms of quantity, but I mean in the quality of it. The United States and NATO countries, what are they doing more? They just destroy everything, and usually, especially in the last several decades, that's led to major problems for NATO countries as well: terrorism, economic instability, that kind of thing. Refugees, right? Like these kind of externalities that they weren't really considered. And if they weren't at the top of the agenda, and they just did what they felt was necessary to achieve their interests. But sowing chaos, on the other hand, covertly, that's something they do really well. And so I am not going to say that Prigozhin was working directly for Ukrainian intelligence services. We don't have necessarily proof, but we do know that that's basically how Prigozhin was acting. And my theory is that it was on the table for him. And that on the one hand, I mean, you think about it, when you are on the one hand fighting this incredibly perilous and difficult war, you do have Prigozhin maybe less so, but his forces with him, a lot of national pride and unity with Russia's cause. That's there, right? I'm not going to say Prigozhin doesn't have any of that, no matter how traitorous or treasonous he was. he was still out on those lines months and months and months in this meat grinder. So he certainly didn't have to do that. Certainly could have defected a long time ago. But at the same time, he had personal ambitions. He had career ambitions. All of this, sometimes success can get to your head. And sometimes when you're successful and also you see dead body after dead body after dead body, your life is under threat every single day. The lives of your friends and family, your comrades, they're under threat every day. Well, ego and psychological distress don't go well together. And then you have possible meddling. If we don't assume that intelligence services weren't doing everything they can to covertly, whether knowingly or not, with Prigozhin, right? Whether Prigozhin knew it or not, try to get to him, then then we just don't understand modern warfare. We don't even understand how war has worked for the West since the end of World War II. So with that said, for me, all of this was about who benefits. And while I'm open to understanding a bit more this idea of this being a psyop, to understand, well, Russia benefits from this because they had NATO's eyes on this manufactured chaos. It ended so quickly. It actually ended pretty decently for Russia. And I'm just curious about why Russia would feel the need to do this, given that things are going quite well on the battlefield. And Russia doesn't really have much to hide. I mean, I get it. In war, there is intelligence. There is a need to, Russia is very much closed in terms of how it publicly talks about the war, and rightfully so. And I think that's correct. You don't want to act like Ukraine here and talk about a counteroffensive for 6 months only to have your counteroffensive completely annihilated in a couple of weeks because your so-called adversary was ready 6 months ago, right? Because they've been preparing for 6 months. So, well, I understand, I understand all of that. It still baffles me on why Russia would feel the need to do a psyop on this. So for me, my position is that Prigozhin's ambitions, coupled with meddling, coupled with the stress of war, all of these things together causes someone like him being in a position that he's in, a position that inevitably will lead to, I mean, you're a part of a private military contractor, you are a businessman, you want to move up, you want to move forward. And if it wasn't for his erraticism before and all of this insubordination, I mean, we would have been saying, right, if this were a year ago or and none of that happened 6 months later, we probably all would be saying Prigozhin's a hero. Of course Prigozhin deserves to be elevated in stature. But now that's all done. He's in exile. And I just want to read the details of the deal with Wagner to conclude. So the details are that he's going to Belarus, says Russian spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. So the criminal case against Wagner private military company PMC founder Evgeny Prigozhin the charges against him will be dropped and he will leave Russia. Peskov added that Wagner's fighters will not be prosecuted, taking into account their efforts on the front lines of the Ukraine conflict. Peskov explained that President Vladimir Putin's team will always have respect for their exploits. PMC contractors who refused to take part in the mutiny and whole units did not will be allowed to sign contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense. Wagner launched a major so this is the context. Wagner launched a major mutiny in Russia overnight, seizing control of the Southern Military District headquarters in the city of Rostov-on-Don, as well as advancing towards Moscow. The insurrection was stopped late on Sunday, following talks between Prigozhin and Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, with the PMC leader agreeing to return his forces to the field camps. So that's how it ended. And it certainly was a strange development. It certainly wasn't necessarily expected, I don't think, from anybody that this would happen. But at the same time, we saw the writing on the wall with Prigozhin. We saw that he had major conflict with Russia's Minister of Defense and top military brass in Russia. And, you know, whatever position one has on that question, whether people are more critical of Prigozhin or Russia's military, because I've seen both sides, you know, say, well, Prigozhin is just unhinged. Russia's Ministry of Defense, maybe not as competent as it should be. But at the same time, I don't think there's any excuse for this behavior. I mean, what did Prigozhin think he was going to accomplish here? He wasn't going to succeed in taking anything on Moscow, right? Taking a position from Russia's armed forces. That just wasn't going to happen. And the further and further he got in this kind of unhinged quest was only going to mean his lot was going to get worse. So I'm not surprised that this ended the way it did. I didn't have, I think some people had jitters. I didn't really have jitters about, or like fears that this was going to become an uncontrollable situation. I do think, though, that this PSYOP theory that some have had in conjunction with Scott Ritter's opinion that it's likely Prigozhin was recruited by Ukrainian intelligence. When it comes to the PSYOP operation on the other side, like this could be Russia's move, right, to distract NATO. It's just a little hard to believe that this would be worth it, because the public relations are bad, and maybe Russia doesn't care. Sometimes countries like Russia and China get criticized for that. They don't care about how they look to the West. And I don't really criticize Russia or China about that. I understand that neither Russia nor China can afford really to spend as much on misinformation, as much on information as the U.S. does on misinformation, right? I understand that. There's only so many resources and so much time when you're in active conflict. But at the same time, there's costs to this, right? There's costs to having someone like Prigozhin behave in this way. And I do think there could be costs to Russia going soft on someone like Prigozhin. Because while on the one hand, I understand the need to respect the achievements of Wagner, I think that over the last 4 to 6 months, it's become quite clear that Wagner needed to be reined in, right? That Prigozhin's behavior was indeed maybe emblematic of a bigger problem with the way that this war was now being fought. And and I think one of the things that might get in the way of some of this judgment, and who am I to say I'm not in this kind of leadership, but I think one factor that could get in the way of maybe clamping down a little bit harder is success, right? Because on the one hand, Prigozhin's success is Russia's success. So it's not as if there was a battlefield quandary here. They've been doing quite well, and things have been going pretty much according to plan, or at least as well as could be expected. So all this is to say is that the public relations, the optics, not great, not good. But at the same time, I don't believe it's going to massively change anything about the conflict. But I do think that this does lend itself to understanding the fact that I think sometimes we can get wrapped up in romanticism when it comes to politics and conflicts and wars, especially wars where we feel rightfully that one side is on the right side of history and the other side is not. And that generally happens in most conflicts, geopolitics or otherwise. So sometimes we can get caught up in romanticism and believe that, let's say, Russia's infallible. I mean, I've had people come to me and say, China is not doing enough for Russia, and Russia is the only country standing up to U.S. empire and to NATO. And to me, I find that to be part of this idea, this romantic understanding or maybe misunderstanding of geopolitics, that because Russia was provoked and pushed into this situation, it is now doing quite a good job at responding and keeping up with principles, that somehow that's a reflection on other countries like China or even others. Right now, every context is different. And I was talking to, I believe it was Brian Berletic over Telegram, and I said, no, it wasn't Brian Berletic. It was, I think it was just somebody on it was just on my Telegram. I was talking to him as well, but I was chatting with the chat group in Telegram and saying, well, if this were China, right? If Russia and China operated the same, Prigozhin would be executed. I mean, executives, corporate executives in China have been executed for arguably a lot less. I mean, for dangerous practices, economic, ethical, etc. But they've been executed. Even local politicians. I mean, there's a joke in China that local government, it's like a kind of like a carousel, because a hint of corruption, right? A hint that's caught. You even had a local executive recently get caught in China with a so-called mistress, and he was a CPC member. He was with a woman that wasn't his wife, and it caused a stir on social media. And immediately, the Communist Party was like, "You're done. You're not a party member anymore. You're punished." So, Russia did punish Prigozhin. He is exiled. But at the same time, the degree of the crime is pretty stark. It's pretty stark to take arms against your own government and do so in a way that insinuated an insurrection that would go all the way to Moscow. I mean, that there really isn't, in the terms of military and conflict and that kind of thing, there's not much worse that you could do other than progressing on that goal. So with that said, everyone, that's what happened. That's my take on it. This chapter hopefully will be closed now, and we will see what happens next. I mean, the curious timing of all of this is that Ukraine's offensive has basically been defeated already. Very quick time, less than a month. Of course, they're saying there's going to be many more offensives. Watch out, more offensives coming. But it's very curious timing that every time Russia seems to be making pretty big advances, whether it was Bakhmut and now this offensive that Ukraine supposedly was trying to wage, Prigozhin seems to be losing his stuff, losing his SHIT, right? Like he losing his mind at these very convenient times. So with that said, everybody, that's my take, and we'll see what happens from here. But I don't think it's going to change anything. I think Russia is still on the same trajectory it's been on. And that, remember, it's not all romantic. There's going to be blips. There's going to be problems. You can't fight a war like this without problems. This is a tough, challenging. This is not a dinner party. This isn't an argument at Thanksgiving dinner, right? Like, no, this is war. This is major conflict. Now, this is great power conflict, and it's one that has cost the lives of thousands of Russians, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, more than 100,000, probably hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. So at a scale like that, you're talking about, indeed, there will be problems. There will be internal problems. And the script that the West was trying to write it smells bad. And so I always say, keep open the possibility that the West had a hand in this in some form or another, whether it's as extreme as Scott Ritter thinks it is, where Prigozhin's literally an intelligence asset for Ukrainian intelligence, hence British intelligence and U.S. intelligence, or whether it's those forces, in my opinion, might have been even more likely, those forces were just getting to work on Prigozhin as they noticed he's someone that could be turned, or he's someone that could be manipulated, because you don't always got to be turned to serve as an asset. So that's not, it doesn't always have to be that you have now put on a badge for the CIA or the MI5, MI6, FBI. It's not that you have to put on a badge and say, I'm with you. It's that your behavior serves their objectives, whether you know it or not. That's what they call a soft agent. So Prigozhin's gone. The insurrection is over. And now on to the next phase of the conflict.